A woman who'd given 7 years of loyal service to the most powerful family in Chicago found herself thrown out into a freezing November night, accused of stealing documents that could destroy an empire. Rachel Morgan wasn't just fired. She was erased. No severance, no references, no chance to defend herself against lies planted by someone who wanted her gone forever. Her life collapsed in a single evening, and the city's underworld made sure no one would hire the woman branded as a traitor to the Carringtons. But there was one person who never believed she was guilty. Ethan Carrington, the 36-year-old heir known in criminal circles as the Shadow. A man whose enemies disappeared without a trace, and whose cold gray eyes had witnessed things that would haunt ordinary men. He'd watched Rachel for 7 years, the only person in that mansion who never feared him, never tried to use him, never looked at him like he was a monster. When his own family cast her out based on fabricated evidence, something in him refused to let it go. What Ethan uncovered when he started digging wasn't just proof of her innocence. It was a secret buried for 28 years. A secret connecting Rachel's blood to the very family that destroyed her, a secret that would shake the foundations of Chicago's elite and expose the sins of his own father. What happened when the truth finally exploded months later at the spring charity ball, in front of 300 of the city's most powerful guests, left everyone speechless. FBI agents walked through those gilded doors. Handcuffs clicked around wrists that had never known restraint. And a woman who'd been invisible for 7 years stood in the center of it all, no longer a servant, no longer a victim, finally claiming the identity that had been stolen from her before she was even born. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good revenge tale, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because the gala was only the beginning, and what Rachel discovered about her mother's death would change everything she thought she knew about the man she was starting to love. But to understand her downfall, we have to turn the clock back to a freezing November morning, when everything was still intact, and Rachel Morgan was still the most trusted housekeeper of the Carrington family. At 5:30 in the morning, fog from Lake Michigan crept across the mansion's tall glass windows, laying a milky veil over the vast garden beyond. Rachel had been awake for half an hour already, as she had been every day for the past 7 years. She moved through the rooms with quiet steps, her calloused hands gliding over the mahogany surface of the 16-seat dining table, checking for specks of dust the naked eye couldn't detect. In the Carrington mansion, there was no such thing as clean enough, only not clean enough, and Rachel had learned that in her very first week here, the baccarat crystal chandeliers floated above the 6-meter ceiling, thousands of prisms catching the faint light of dawn like frozen tears. Oil paintings by 19th-century artists lined the walls, unfamiliar faces gazing down with cold judgment. The marble floors imported from Italy bit into her feet despite the heating system running all night. It was the most beautiful house Rachel had ever seen, yet it had never made her feel warm. It felt more like a museum than a place people lived, and the people who lived inside it were just as cold. Rachel paused at a window overlooking the garden, her thoughts drifting to a dorm room 20 minutes away by car, where Hannah was sleeping, where her younger sister was preparing for the most important final exams in her nursing program. Rachel had transferred money into Hannah's account the week before, enough for her to focus on studying without worrying about rent or textbooks. That was why she was here, why she had endured everything for nearly a decade. Footsteps on the staircase pulled Rachel from her thoughts. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Ethan Carrington always walked with a steady rhythm, neither hurried nor slow, as though he knew exactly where he was going and had nothing to prove to anyone. She turned and inclined her head in proper form. Ethan stopped at the foot of the stairs, a charcoal gray suit hugging his tall frame, neatly trimmed black hair, and unreadable slate eyes fixed on her. He had returned from New York the night before. Rachel knew that because she was the one who had prepared his bedroom at 2 in the morning. She also noticed the faint bruise on the back of his right hand, but she didn't ask. She never did. 7 years in this house had taught her the first and most important rule: see nothing, hear nothing, know nothing. Ethan gave her a brief nod, a gesture he didn't offer to any of the other staff in the house. Then he walked toward the bar and poured himself a glass of scotch, even though the sun hadn't fully risen. Rachel went back to work, but she could feel his gaze lingering on her back for a few seconds before he finally turned away. That was the strange thing between them. Something unspoken yet known to both of them. Rachel didn't fear Ethan the way the others did, and Ethan didn't treat her like a piece of walking furniture. At 7 in the morning, the sharp click of high heels against marble announced the arrival of Victoria Carrington. She entered the dining room in an ivory Chanel dress, platinum blonde hair styled to perfection, and a gaze sharp enough to cut glass. The scent of Jo Malone perfume spread through the room, heavy and overpowering. Victoria took her usual seat, her gaze sweeping over the table Rachel had set, searching for any flaw. Finding none, her red-painted lips curved into a smile that never reached her eyes. "Tonight is the Carrington Foundation's annual gala," Victoria said, her voice sweet as honey though Rachel could hear the blade beneath it. "And I want everything to be absolutely perfect. Not a single mistake, do you understand?" Rachel nodded, keeping her face blank. But when she turned away, she caught Victoria's eyes still tracking her. There was something in that look Rachel couldn't read, a cold calculation, as though Victoria were studying a chess piece and deciding her next move. Rachel didn't know that move had been planned long before she realized she was the target. The gala night arrived faster than Rachel had expected. By 8 in the evening, the Carrington mansion had transformed into a sea of golden light, with more than 300 guests in tuxedos and evening gowns worth more than a year of her salary. A jazz band played softly in one corner of the grand hall. Polite laughter drifted through the air, and Rachel moved like a ghost through the crowd, supervising the service staff, making sure every champagne glass stayed full and every tray of canapes was never empty. No one looked at her. No one noticed her. That was exactly her job, to become invisible so everything could run flawlessly. At 10:32, everything changed. Rachel was checking the eastern bar area when one of the security guards approached her, his face tight with tension. "Mr. Carrington wants to see you," he said in a low, urgent voice. "Right now, in the office." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine, but she kept her face calm and followed the guard upstairs to the second floor. Harrison Carrington's office sat at the end of the western corridor, the heavy oak door standing slightly ajar. When Rachel stepped inside, she saw Harrison behind the massive desk, his face flushed with fury. Catherine Carrington sat on the leather sofa in the corner, cold and distant as always, and Victoria stood by the window, red lips curved in a smile. Rachel couldn't read. 2 security men blocked the door behind her. "Close it," Harrison ordered, his voice like the growl of a wounded animal. Rachel heard the door slam behind her and knew this wasn't an ordinary conversation. She tried to keep her voice steady. "Sir, is something wrong?" Harrison slammed his hand onto the desk, making the lamp shudder. "Something wrong," he roared. "Documents from my safe are gone. That's what's wrong. The encrypted USB drive containing the family's private financial ledgers has vanished, and you're asking me what's wrong." Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. She didn't understand why she was standing here, in this room, in front of these people. "Sir, I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to control it. "What does this have to do with me?" Victoria stepped away from the window, her movement smooth like a cat stalking its prey. "I saw you walking into the hallway leading to Uncle Harrison's office tonight," she said, her voice sweet but dripping with venom. "Around 8:47. The security cameras recorded it very clearly." Rachel shook her head, her heart hammering in her chest. "I was only checking the guest rooms as assigned," she explained. "I never go into Mr. Carrington's office without permission." Then explain this. Victoria tossed a small USB drive onto the desk. "We found it in your coat pocket in the staff room." Rachel stared at the device as if it were a venomous snake. She had never seen it before. She had never touched it. "It isn't mine," she said, her voice rising with panic. "Someone put it there. I swear I didn't take anything." Harrison came around the desk and stopped close to Rachel. He was nearly a foot taller than she, his shadow falling over her like a dark cloud. 7 years, he said in an icy voice. 7 years I trusted you, and this is how you repay me. "Sir, please let me explain." The office door burst open. Ethan Carrington strode in, his piercing gaze sweeping the room in an instant, taking in everything. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice not loud but heavy enough to silence everyone. Harrison turned to his son with irritation. "This isn't your concern, Ethan. It's an internal matter." Ethan stepped farther inside, positioning himself between Rachel and Harrison like a wall. "She's being accused of theft based on a video clip and a USB found in her pocket," he said, his tone cold and analytical. "Anyone can edit footage. Anyone can plant evidence. This isn't how we do things." Victoria scoffed. "Always defending the help, Ethan. It's almost pathetic." Ethan turned toward Victoria, and Rachel saw his jaw tighten. "Watch your words, Victoria." The air in the room froze. Harrison studied his son with a warning look. "Are you challenging your father's decision?" he asked in a dangerous voice. Are you putting a servant above your own family? Ethan didn't retreat. I'm saying firing a loyal employee of 7 years without solid proof is a mistake, he replied. If father is wrong, we lose someone who knows far too much about how this house operates. If father is right, we can deal with it later. Rushing this benefits no one. Harrison was silent for a long time, staring at his son with a mix of anger and calculation. Finally he spoke, his voice cold as steel. She leaves this house tonight. No pay, no reference letter, nothing at all. And if I discover she tells anyone about what she's seen in this house, there won't be a second conversation. Rachel felt her knees threaten to buckle. Almost a decade. All of her youth she had given to this house, and it ended like this. She looked at Ethan, the only man in the room who had tried to defend her. He looked back at her, gray eyes unreadable, yet there was something in them she couldn't decipher. Then the 2 security men stepped forward, seized her arms, and Rachel was led out of the room, out of the life she had spent her entire youth building. They shoved her out the back door, where none of the guests' cars could see. Rachel nearly fell when her feet hit the thick layer of snow blanketing the ground. The door slammed shut behind her with a dull crack, and suddenly she was standing alone in a Chicago November night, the temperature -7 degrees, wearing nothing but her thin uniform and flat shoes. Her phone was still in the staff room, along with her wallet, her coat, and everything she owned. Rachel stood there for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, letting the cold slice into her skin and drag her out of shock. She didn't have time to think about what had just happened. She didn't have time to be angry or to grieve. She had to move, or she'd freeze to death right here. Rachel started walking toward the rear gate of the estate. Snow swallowed her ankles. Icy seeped through the thin fabric of her shoes. She pictured the map in her head, Hannah's dorm in University Village, roughly 12 kilometers south, 12 kilometers in snow. No coat, no money, no phone. She'd done harder things than this. She'd survived worse nights than this. Rachel wrapped her arms tightly around herself, trying to trap the last scraps of warmth in her body. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. She counted each footfall to keep her mind focused. Wind off Lake Michigan slammed into her face, carrying needles of snow. Her lips began to crack and she licked them to moisten them, even though she knew it only made them dry faster. When she reached the main road, Rachel scanned for anywhere she could shelter for a moment. A bus stop stood about 100 meters away, its glass roof able to block some of the wind. She headed for it, her feet already numbing to the point she could barely feel the ground beneath each step. Inside the bus stop, Rachel sat on the freezing metal bench and tried to think. She needed money for the train. She didn't have money. She needed to call Hannah. She didn't have a phone. The choices narrowed to one: walk. Rachel stood and kept moving. She passed through Lincoln Park, where million-dollar homes sat silent in the dark, warm yellow light glowing through their windows like a taunt. She walked through Old Town, where crowded bars spilled music and laughter onto the streets. No one looked at her. No one noticed the woman shivering through the snow in a black uniform. She was just another ghost in the Chicago night. 2 hours later, Rachel stopped outside a 24-hour convenience store, standing by the glass doors to soak up a little warmth from inside. The cashier eyed her with suspicion but said nothing. Rachel stayed 5 minutes, long enough for feeling to creep back into her fingers, then kept going. She didn't think about Harrison Carrington or the baseless accusation. She didn't think about Victoria and the victorious glint in her eyes. She didn't think about Ethan and the way he'd tried to protect her, uselessly. She only thought about the next step, and the step after that, and the one after that. At 4 in the morning, Rachel stood in front of Hannah's dormitory, the security guard staring at her like a lost homeless woman. She said her sister's name, her voice raw from cold and exhaustion. The guard hesitated, then picked up the phone and called upstairs. 10 minutes later, Hannah ran into the lobby, eyes red from being dragged out of sleep. And when she saw Rachel standing there with purple lips, hair crusted with ice, trembling uncontrollably, she screamed and threw her arms around her sister. 3 months after that fateful night, Rachel Morgan was living in a studio apartment in Englewood on the south side of Chicago, where gunshots echoed every night and police rarely bothered to show up. The place measured less than 25 square meters, with peeling paint on the walls, windows stuffed with cardboard because the glass had shattered long ago, and a heating system that only worked when it felt like it. The rent was $1,200 a month, the cheapest Rachel could find, and even that amount was becoming an unbearable burden. Rumors spread faster than wildfire. Rachel Morgan, the traitor to the Carrington family, the thief of confidential documents, the woman who couldn't be trusted. The Carrington name reached into every major hotel, every upscale restaurant, every domestic staffing agency in the city. No one dared to hire her. Rachel submitted more than 50 job applications in her first month. All of them were rejected or ignored. By the second month, she stopped counting. She found the jobs nobody wanted, the kind that paid in cash and didn't ask about the past. During the day, she washed dishes at a small Vietnamese pho shop in Argyle, where the owner named Nguyen didn't speak much English and didn't care about gossip. At night, she cleaned an aging office building in the West Loop from 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning, alone with a mop and endless corridors. Her income hovered around $400 a week if she was lucky, and most of it went straight to Hannah, so she wouldn't have to worry about tuition and living costs. Rachel didn't tell Hannah the truth. She said she was looking for a new job, that everything was fine, that Hannah should focus on school and not worry about her. But the truth was, Rachel was sinking. She ate one meal a day, usually a packet of instant noodles split in half, one half for lunch and the other for dinner. She drank tap water instead of anything else. She went hungry so Hannah could afford textbooks and dorm fees. Her clothes started to hang loose, her cheekbones jutted sharply, and her eyes sank deep as if she hadn't slept in nights. On a Saturday afternoon in the 12th week, Hannah came to visit without warning. Rachel opened the door and found her sister standing there with a bag of takeout from a Thai restaurant near the dorm. The smile on Hannah's face vanished when she saw the apartment. The single ceiling bulb flickered weakly. The old refrigerator hummed, and when Hannah opened it, there was only half a carton of milk that had expired 2 weeks earlier and a nearly empty bottle of mustard. "You told me everything was fine," Hannah said, her voice shaking as she fought anger and heartbreak. "You said you had savings. You told me not to worry." Rachel stood still, not knowing what to say. She had braced herself for many things, but not for this moment, not for the wounded, betrayed look in her sister's eyes. "I can see your ribs through that shirt," Hannah went on, her voice rising. "How long has it been since you ate a real meal? A week, 2 weeks. Hannah, don't Hannah me," the young woman almost shouted, tears starting to spill down her cheeks. "Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I can't see you're sending every dollar to me while you starve? I'll quit school. I'll get a job." "No," Rachel cut in, cold and final. "I didn't drag you across 6 states and work myself to exhaustion for 11 years just so you'd drop out when you're only 1 year from graduating. You're finishing the nursing program. That isn't a request." "Then what are you going to do?" Hannah asked, her voice softer now but still thick with fear. "Starve to death." Rachel didn't answer right away. She looked at the cardboard-covered window, at the darkness of the dangerous neighborhood outside, at the life she had fallen into in less than 3 months. She'd survived worse than this, she told herself. She'd survived Frank Doyle and his beatings. She'd survived nights, sleeping on the street, with little Hannah curled in her arms. She'd survived this too. "I'll find a way," Rachel said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I always do." Hannah studied her, and in that moment the young woman looked far older than her years. She didn't say anything else, only set the Thai food bag on the wobbly wooden table and sat down to wait. Rachel knew what that meant. It was Hannah's way of saying she wasn't going anywhere until she saw her sister eat a proper meal. While Rachel was struggling to survive in Englewood, another investigation was quietly unfolding in the shadows of the Carrington mansion. Ethan Carrington didn't believe Rachel was guilty, not because of affection or sympathy, but because of simple logic. Rachel Morgan wasn't a fool, and only a fool would hide stolen evidence in her own coat pocket and let it be discovered so easily. 2 weeks after the gala night, Ethan summoned Michael Torres to his private office on the 3rd floor, a room even Harrison rarely entered. "I need you to recheck all the security camera footage from that night," Ethan said, his voice even and cold as always. "Not the copies my father keeps, but the original files from the server." Michael nodded without asking why. He had worked for Ethan long enough to know that when Ethan gave an order, all he had to do was carry it out. 3 days later, Michael returned with a laptop and a tense expression. "You were right," he said, opening the screen for Ethan to see. 15 minutes of footage were deleted, from 8:32 to 8:47 that night, right before the cameras recorded Rachel walking into the hallway. Ethan stared at the screen, his expression hardening as he processed the footage. "Who has access to the security system?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. "Mr. Harrison, you, me, Thomas Reed, and Victoria," Michael replied. "No one else has the administrator password." Ethan went silent for a long moment. Thomas Reed was the family lawyer and had no motive. Michael was absolutely loyal. Ethan knew that. As surely as he knew the sun rose in the east, Harrison wouldn't sabotage his own safe. That left Victoria. "Keep digging," Ethan said, his voice several degrees colder. "Bank accounts, phone calls, everything. I want to know what my cousin's hiding." More than 10 kilometers away, in a luxurious penthouse in the Gold Coast overlooking Lake Michigan, Victoria Carrington was sitting alone in the dark, the only light coming from the phone in her hand. The flash drive was hidden in a secret compartment behind her wardrobe, safe and secure. Victoria wasn't foolish enough to destroy it. That tiny device held enough information to send Harrison Carrington to prison for 20 years, and it was the best insurance policy she had within the family. She dialed a number and waited. After 3 rings, a man's voice answered on the other end. "It's done," Victoria said, her voice low and careful. "The Morgan girls disappeared. No one's going to believe her, even if she tries to talk." "Good," the man replied. "And the drive?" Victoria hesitated for a second. "It's still safe with me." Silence stretched on the other end. "We agreed you'd hand it over once everything was finished," the man said, his tone firmer this time. Victoria bit her lip. "I'll give it to you when I'm ready," she replied, keeping her confidence steady while calculations churned inside her. "Don't forget who decides things here." She ended the call before the man could object. Victoria rose and walked to the window overlooking the Chicago skyline at night. Her plan had worked perfectly. Rachel Morgan, the irritating maid Victoria had watched for 7 years, had finally vanished from her life. But that was only the first step. Victoria knew things no one else in the family knew. She knew about Margaret Morgan. She knew about James Whitmore, her biological father. And most importantly, she knew who Rachel Morgan truly was. That was why she had to eliminate Rachel before the truth ever had a chance to surface. If the world learned that Rachel was James's biological daughter, that she and Victoria shared the same father, that Rachel was the rightful heir to half the fortune Victoria was enjoying, everything would collapse. Everything Victoria had, her identity, her status, her wealth, rested on a colossal lie, and she'd do anything to protect that lie. Victoria's phone vibrated with a message from an inside source at the mansion. She read it and her face drained of color in the darkness. Ethan was investigating. He was rechecking the cameras. Victoria tightened her grip on the phone until her nails dug into her palm hard enough to almost draw blood. She had underestimated her cousin. She'd thought Ethan wouldn't care about a maid enough to ask questions. She'd been wrong. Now she needed a new plan. And this time, she wouldn't leave a single loose end behind. 1 week after Michael reported the altered footage, Ethan Carrington stood outside a rundown apartment in Englewood, studying the peeling paint on the doorframe and the long crack running along the hallway wall. He'd come alone. No bodyguards, no luxury car, only a black coat and a calculating intensity as he scanned the neighborhood for any sign of danger. It had taken Michael 2 days to track down the address, and when he'd delivered it to Ethan, irritation had crept into his voice. "This area isn't safe, even for people like us," Michael had said. Ethan hadn't commented. He knocked 3 times, steady and patient. Inside, there was movement, cautious footsteps approaching the door, then silence. He knew Rachel was peering through the gap in the door secured by a safety chain. "Wrong building, Mr. Carrington." Rachel's voice came from inside, cool and guarded. Ethan didn't seem surprised that she recognized him. "I need to talk to you." "I've got nothing to say to anyone from that house." Silence stretched for several seconds. Ethan could have left, could have gone back to the information Michael was still gathering, could have handled Victoria in his own way without Rachel Morgan's involvement, but he didn't. "The camera footage from that night was edited," he said, his voice low enough that only Rachel could hear. 15 minutes were completely erased before you appeared in the hallway. Someone set you up." Silence again. Then the chain slid free. Rachel opened the door just wide enough for Ethan to see her, and he had to work to keep his face unreadable when he took in the changes. She was far thinner than the last time he'd seen her, cheekbones cutting sharply, gray-green eyes sunken and wary, but she still stood straight, still met his gaze without fear, still the Rachel Morgan he'd observed for 7 years. "And what does that have to do with me?" she asked. "You were framed," Ethan said flatly, "and I'm finding out who did it and why." Rachel let out a short laugh with no humor in it. "How touching. The son of the man who threw me into the snow in the middle of the night now wants to play knight in shining armor." "I'm not playing anything." Ethan stepped forward 1 pace, and Rachel didn't retreat. "Someone in my family is trying to hide something, and they used you as a scapegoat." I want to know who and why. So this is about you, not me. This is about the truth." Rachel studied him for a long moment, her eyes tracing every line in his face as if searching for deceit. Ethan let her look. He had nothing to hide, at least not from her. "I don't trust you," Rachel said at last, her voice flat. "I don't trust anyone with the Carrington name, and I don't want to be involved in anything connected to your family ever again." "I understand." Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small phone, the kind of burner device bought with cash and no trail. He set it on the doorframe beside her hand. "If you change your mind," he said, "or if anything happens, there's only one number saved in it." Rachel stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. "I don't need your help." "You don't," Ethan agreed, his tone empty of emotion. "But someone went very far to erase you, and I don't think they're going to stop just because you lost your job." He turned and walked away without looking back. Rachel stood in the doorway, watching his figure vanish into the dark stairwell, the phone still resting on the sill. She wanted to throw it away. She wanted to forget Ethan Carrington had ever stood here in the filthy hallway of this cheap building, talking to her about conspiracies and truth. But she didn't. Instead, she picked up the phone, weighed it in her palm, then slipped it into the bottom drawer of the battered wooden dresser. Just in case, she told herself. Only just in case. 10 days after her meeting with Ethan, Rachel received a call from Hannah at 3 in the afternoon, in the middle of her dishwashing shift at Mrs. Nguyen's faux shop. Her sister's voice shook so badly that Rachel had to grip the edge of the sink just to stay upright. "Something's wrong," Hannah said, the young woman's voice unraveling with panic. "I got an email from the school's financial aid office. They said someone filed an anonymous complaint, claiming I falsified my scholarship application. They suspended me pending investigation, and I have 48 hours to leave the dorm." Rachel felt the blood in her veins turn to ice. She knew instantly this wasn't a coincidence. She knew who was behind it. Hannah hadn't cheated on anything. Her sister was the hardest working student she knew, and this accusation arriving now, at this exact moment, couldn't be random. They were targeting Hannah to get to her. They were sending a message that Rachel could run but couldn't hide, that even when she had nothing left to lose, they'd still find something to take from her. "Stay calm, Hannah," Rachel said, her voice far steadier than what churned inside her. "Don't do anything. Don't talk to anyone. I'll figure this out. But Rachel, I'll call you back." Rachel ended the call and stood there for 1 minute, then 2, her hand still clenched around her battered phone. She looked down at fingers roughened by work, at the hands that had done everything to protect Hannah for 11 years. She could endure anything for herself. She'd endured Frank Doyle. She'd endured sleeping on the streets. She'd endured the humiliation of being framed and fired. But Hannah was the red line. Hannah was the final boundary no one was allowed to cross. Rachel asked Mrs. Nguyen to leave early and almost ran back to her apartment. She opened the bottom drawer of the wooden dresser and took out the burner phone she'd shoved there 10 days earlier with every intention of never using. She powered it on, waited for the screen to glow, then tapped the only number saved in the contacts. Ethan answered on the second ring. "Rachel." His voice held no surprise, as if he'd been expecting the call. "They're going after my sister," Rachel said without greeting or preamble. "They accused Hannah of scholarship fraud. She'll be expelled if I don't do something." A brief silence stretched on the other end. "You know who's behind it, Victoria." Rachel didn't need proof to know that. She felt it in her bones. "I'll send Michael to pick you and Hannah up in 2 hours, Ethan said, his tone shifting into action. "I've got a safe place no one knows about. You'll stay there until we finish dealing with this." Rachel clenched her teeth. She hated this. She hated having to rely on a Carrington, hated placing Hannah's safety in the hands of a man she didn't trust. But she had no other choice. "I agree," she said, her voice hard as steel. "But you need to understand one thing. I'm not doing this because I trust you. I'm doing it because nobody gets to touch my sister. And if you betray me, if you do anything that harms Hannah, I won't need the law or the FBI. I'll handle you myself, even if it's the last thing I ever do." Ethan paused for a beat, then his voice came back. Not angry, not offended, only edged with cold respect. "I understand." "Good." Rachel ended the call. She looked down at the phone in her hand and realized that from this moment on, her life had veered onto an entirely new path. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was stepping into a war. Michael Torres picked them up exactly 2 hours after the call, driving a black SUV with no distinctive plates, the kind of vehicle people noticed and forgot immediately. Rachel had made it to Hannah's dorm in time, explained briefly that they needed to go somewhere safe for a few days, and her sister, though full of confusion and questions, trusted Rachel enough not to argue. The safe apartment was in the West Loop, on the 12th floor of a high-rise with no name on the entrance, only a number. Inside it was clean and fully equipped, not lavish like the Carrington mansion, but far warmer than the decaying place in Englewood. 2 bedrooms, a spacious living room, a kitchen stocked with food, and most important of all, a security system, Michael explained, could detect anyone approaching the door from roughly 30 meters away. "I'll stay in the living room," Michael told Rachel. After Hannah went into the bedroom to rest from the exhausting day, 24/7. "If you need anything, just say the word." Rachel nodded without thanking him. She wasn't here because of anyone's kindness. She was here because it was the only way to protect Hannah, and both sides understood that perfectly. Ethan arrived in the evening, after Hannah had fallen asleep. He brought a laptop and a thick folder, set them on the coffee table, and sat across from Rachel. There were no polite greetings, no small talk, only business. "I need you to tell me everything you know about Victoria," Ethan said. "Everything you observed during 7 years in the mansion. Her habits, secret calls, moments when she behaved strangely." Rachel studied him for a moment, weighing him. She still didn't trust Ethan Carrington, but she understood that in this fight they shared the same enemy. "Victoria hated me from the first day I walked into that house," Rachel began, her tone flat as if reciting a report. "She looked at me in a way I couldn't understand, not just the usual contempt for a servant, but something deeper, more personal, as though she knew something about me that I didn't even know myself." Ethan didn't interrupt, only typed notes into the laptop. Rachel went on. "Victoria has a habit of disappearing on Thursday afternoons from 2 until 5. She says she's going to the spa, but I've seen her come back with dry hair and no trace of massage oil. She also takes calls. She has to step onto the balcony to answer, always speaking very softly and ending them the moment someone comes near. Anything else?" "About 3 years ago," Rachel said, "I accidentally saw her in Mr. Harrison's library. She was reading a thick folder labeled Whitmore. When she noticed me, she jumped and hid it quickly. I didn't know what was inside, but from that point on she watched me differently, like she was afraid I might tell someone." Ethan stopped typing, his gray eyes narrowing. "Whitmore." Rachel nodded. "That's the surname of Victoria's biological father, right? James Whitmore, Mr. Harrison's business partner." "Yes," Ethan said, but something in his voice shifted, a tension Rachel couldn't quite read. They talked for another hour, Rachel recounting everything she could remember, from the smallest details to observations she had never imagined would matter. When she finished, Ethan closed the laptop and looked at her. "You're a very sharp observer." "That's how I survived," Rachel replied. Her voice held no pride, only truth. "When you grow up in a house where you can be beaten at any moment, you learn to read the air, read moods, read everything around you so you know when to run." Ethan studied her for a long moment, and in that instant Rachel saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected from a man like him. Not pity. She'd despise pity, but understanding, the kind that only came from someone who'd lived through something similar. The moment passed quickly. Ethan stood, gave her a brief nod, and left. Rachel watched him go, reminding herself that this was only business, nothing personal here, nothing but a temporary arrangement between 2 people who happened to share the same enemy. The next day, Ethan Carrington walked into lawyer Thomas Reed's office in the Loop without an appointment. The secretary tried to stop him, but one look from his piercing slate-colored gaze froze her in place, and Ethan went straight through the oak door into the workspace of the man who had served the Carrington family for 30 years. Thomas Reed sprang to his feet when he saw Ethan, the color draining noticeably from his face. "Ethan," he said, trying to sound calm while anxiety leaked through. "You should have called first. I have a meeting in 15 minutes. Cancel it." Ethan shut the door behind him and strode to the desk, setting a thick folder on its surface. Thomas stared at it like a bomb waiting to explode. "What is that?" "Proof that you laundered money for my father through at least 17 shell companies over the past 20 years, Ethan replied, his voice as mild as if he were discussing the weather. "Enough to send you to prison for 20 years if the FBI gets hold of it." Thomas collapsed back into his chair, every trace of color gone from his face. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice now hoarse. "The truth." Ethan pulled out a chair and sat across from him, gray eyes never leaving the aging lawyer's face. "You're going to tell me everything you know about James Whitmore, about his relationship with my father, and about any secrets this family's hiding." Thomas closed his eyes, and in that moment he looked far older than his years. 30 years of keeping secrets seemed to weigh on his shoulders, and Ethan knew that with a little more pressure the wall would crack. "James Whitmore was your father's closest friend since high school," Thomas began, his voice small and tired. "They built the Carrington empire from nothing. James handled the legitimate side while Harrison handled the rest." "I know the public history," Ethan cut in. "I want what isn't public." Thomas sighed, opened his desk drawer, and removed a small wooden box. He set it on the table but did not open it. "About 29 years ago, James met a woman," Thomas said, "a bartender at one of the Carrington clubs. Her name was Margaret, and James loved her in a way he'd never loved Eleanor, his legal wife." Ethan stayed silent, waiting. "Harrison didn't accept the relationship," Thomas went on. "He thought Margaret wasn't worthy, that she would damage the family's reputation. When Harrison discovered Margaret was pregnant, he threatened her, saying that if she didn't disappear, he would make sure she and the child would never have a peaceful life." Ethan felt his jaw tighten, and Margaret disappeared. "She left Chicago before James even knew she was pregnant." Thomas nodded. 2 years later, James somehow learned the truth and planned to go find Margaret and the child. But he died in a car accident on the way. "Accident." Ethan repeated the word, his voice flat while his eyes sharpened like blades. Thomas did not meet his gaze. "That's what the official report says. You don't believe it was an accident. That isn't for me to believe or not." Thomas finally looked at Ethan, and in his eyes was fear buried for 3 decades. "I only know. Harrison paid me to keep quiet about all of this, and I stayed silent because I was too afraid to do otherwise." "The child?" Ethan asked quietly. "James and Margaret's child. Was it a daughter or a son?" "A daughter," Thomas said. "She was born about 28 years ago. I don't know where she is now, or even if she's still alive. Harrison kept that information to himself." Ethan stood, took the folder, and headed for the door. Before he left, Thomas called after him. "What are you going to do with this information?" "I'm going to find the truth." Ethan didn't turn around. The whole truth. 3 hours later, Michael called Ethan while he was driving back to the safe apartment. "I found her," Michael said, his voice tight in a different way. Margaret Morgan was her full name. She left Chicago in 1996 while pregnant, moved to Indiana, then Ohio, then Michigan, and finally settled in the suburbs of Detroit. She died of cervical cancer 17 years ago. "And the child?" "Rachel Morgan," Michael replied. "Born on March 14, 1997, 28 years old. Worked as a housekeeper for the Carrington family for 7 years before being fired 3 months ago on charges of theft." Ethan pulled over to the side of the road, his hands tightening on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. Rachel Morgan was James Whitmore's daughter. Rachel Morgan was the biological daughter of the best friend of the man who had treated her like furniture for 7 years. Rachel Morgan was Victoria's half-sister. Harrison had adopted Victoria after James died, giving her the Carrington name to bury the scandal. But the blood tie remained, and Victoria knew. That was why Victoria hated Rachel so fiercely. That was why Victoria had to erase Rachel at any cost. Because if the truth came out, Rachel would be the rightful heir to half of James Whitmore's fortune, and Victoria would lose everything. Ethan arrived at the safe apartment that night with a small wooden box in his hands. Rachel was sitting at the dining table, a cup of coffee gone cold in front of her. And the moment she saw the look on his face, she knew something had shifted. Hannah was asleep, Michael was standing guard in the hallway outside, and the apartment was so quiet Rachel could hear her own heartbeat. Ethan set the box on the table in front of her without speaking. Rachel looked at it, then at him, then back at the box. "What is this?" she asked. "Your mother's things." Ethan took the chair across from her, his intense focus never leaving her face. "Michael found it in a storage facility in Detroit. Margaret paid the rent on that unit 10 years ago, as if she knew one day someone would need what was inside." Rachel felt her hands tremble as she touched the lid. She didn't understand why her mother's belongings were here, why Ethan was the one bringing them to her. Margaret Morgan had died 17 years ago, and Rachel had thought she'd buried everything connected to her along with the cheap headstone in a cemetery outside Detroit. She opened the box. Inside were several old yellowed photographs. A silver bracelet Rachel recognized instantly because her mother wore it every day until she was too weak to wear anything at all, and a brown leather notebook worn thin by time. Rachel picked up the notebook, and when she opened the first page, she recognized her mother's slanted handwriting immediately. She flipped through, skimming entries about daily life, about bartending, about exhausting late nights. Then she stopped on a page dated nearly 30 years earlier, and her heart seemed to stall. Today he told me he loves me, Margaret had written. James says he'll leave Eleanor, that he'll build a new life with me. I know it's crazy, but I believe him. I believe his eyes when he looks at me. No one's ever looked at me that way before. Rachel kept reading, the journal pages unfolding the love story between her mother and a man named James. A man Rachel had never heard of in all 28 years of her life. Then she reached the entry where everything changed. Harrison knows about us, Margaret wrote, the handwriting now shaky and rushed. He came to see me last night and said that if I don't disappear, he'll make sure the baby and I will never have a peaceful life. He knows I'm pregnant even though I haven't told James yet. He knows everything and he won't let James leave his family for someone like me. I'm terrified. I'm so scared I can't breathe. But I have to protect my child. I have to leave before he does something I can't fight. Rachel turned the next pages, reading about her mother's flight across states, about lonely nights in cheap motels, about the day she was born in a small Indiana hospital with only one nurse and no one holding her mother's hand. Then she reached the final written entry, dated 28 years ago. They say James died in a car accident, Margaret wrote. I read it in the paper and I couldn't breathe for hours. He was on his way to Michigan, to me and Rachel. He somehow found out where we were and he was coming. Then he died. His brakes failed on the highway and he crashed into the divider. They say it was an accident, but I know Harrison. I know what he's capable of. I'll never be able to prove anything, but in my heart I know he didn't die in an accident. He died because he chose me over their family, and Harrison never forgave betrayal. Rachel closed the journal, her hands shaking so badly she had to set it down on the table. She didn't cry. She'd forgotten how to cry a long time ago, but something inside her was splintering, sharp shards of a truth she'd never imagined. James Whitmore was her father. Harrison Carrington had threatened her mother, torn her family apart, and might have killed her father. She'd worked for the enemies of her family for 7 years without ever knowing it. Ethan sat in silence across from her, not trying to comfort her, not offering hollow words. He simply waited, giving Rachel time to absorb the truth she'd just swallowed. At last, Rachel lifted her head and looked at him. He knew, she said, her voice rough. Harrison knew who I was from the beginning. That's why he treated me that way for 7 years. That's why he was ready to believe the lies without proof. He wanted me to disappear the way he made my mother disappear. Ethan nodded, his face unreadable but his gray eyes darker than usual. And Victoria knows too, he said. That's why she framed you. She's afraid that if the truth comes out, you'll be the rightful heir to half of James Whitmore's fortune, and she'll lose everything. Rachel looked down at her mother's journal, thinking of the woman who'd raised her alone in poverty, who'd died of cancer without money for treatment, who'd carried this secret to her grave to protect her. Her mother had sacrificed her entire life to keep her safe from these people. And now Rachel was sitting here in the middle of a war she'd never wanted to enter, with the truth of her identity lying in the hands of her enemies. Rachel rose from the table and walked to the window, staring out at the Chicago skyline at night. This city had taken her mother, her father, and 7 years of her life. This city had turned her into someone homeless, someone framed, someone no one believed. And now this same city was telling her she belonged to one of its most powerful families, that the blood in her veins carried the Whitmore name, that she had a claim to millions of dollars. The irony was so sharp she almost wanted to laugh. She didn't want it. Ethan stood and moved closer, keeping enough distance not to invade her space but near enough that she knew he was there. You need time to process all of this, he said, his voice low and steady. This isn't something anyone can swallow in a single night. Rachel turned to face him, her eyes cold and sharp as steel. I don't need time, she replied. I need you to answer one question. Ask it. What do you expect from me? Ethan studied her for a long moment. I don't expect anything, he said at last. This is the truth about who you are. You have the right to know it. What you do with it is your decision. Rachel let out a humorless laugh. So what do you think I'm going to do? Take the Whitmore name, demand my inheritance, step into the world of people who destroyed my family and pretend I belong there. I don't think anything at all, Ethan said bluntly. I'm only giving you the truth. The rest is yours. Rachel turned fully away from the window and faced him. She looked into the cold, gray eyes of this man, the heir to an empire that had killed her father, ruined her mother, and turned her life into hell. And she saw the strangest thing. He wasn't like Harrison. He didn't wear cruelty beneath a polite shell. He was cruel in an honest way. And that honesty, frightening as it was something she could respect. I don't want their money, Rachel said, her voice clear and final. I don't want the Whitmore name or anything tied to that family. I've lived 28 years as Rachel Morgan, and I'll die with that name." "Then what do you want?" Ethan asked, showing no surprise at her answer. Rachel stepped closer, the distance between them now less than a meter. "I want justice," she said, carving each word into stone. "I want Victoria to pay for what she did to me and Hannah. I want Harrison to face the consequences for what he did to my mother and my father. I want them to lose everything they treasure most, their money, their reputation, their power. I want them to know what it feels like to have everything taken away. That's revenge, not justice," Ethan said, his tone not judging, only stating a fact. "Is there a difference?" Rachel shot back. Ethan went quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "No. With what they've done, there isn't any difference at all." Rachel studied him, and for the first time since she'd been thrown out of the Carrington mansion into the freezing snow, she felt something that resembled hope. Not hope for a happy future, but hope for reckoning, for the people who'd hurt her to finally pay. "So do we have a deal?" she asked. Ethan met her gaze, and in those cold gray eyes Rachel saw the same fire burning that was now blazing inside her. "We have a deal," he said. 3 days after her conversation with Ethan, Victoria struck. Rachel was sitting in the living room of the safe apartment, rereading her mother's journal for what felt like the 100th time, when the first gunshot cracked through the hallway. The sound was dry and sharp, nothing like in the movies, and it took Rachel a second to register what it was before survival instincts honed during years with Frank Doyle slammed into place. She bolted for Hannah's bedroom, shouting her sister's name as the second and third shots rang out in rapid succession. Hannah opened the door with a face drained of color, and Rachel grabbed her hand and dragged her into the bathroom, the only room without windows and with the thickest concrete walls. "Lock the door and don't come out no matter what happens," Rachel said quickly, her voice astonishingly calm even to herself. "If I'm not back in 10 minutes, call this number." She shoved the burner phone into Hannah's hand and slammed the bathroom door shut. Outside, the gunfire stopped, replaced by the thud of blows, groans, and something heavy slamming into walls. Rachel scanned for a weapon, her fingers closing around the biggest kitchen knife she could find, and she edged toward the front door with soft steps, her back pressed to the wall. The apartment door had been kicked in. Michael Torres lay in the hallway, blood pouring from a shoulder wound but still grappling with one of the attackers. 2 other men dressed in black with their faces covered were advancing into the apartment with guns in hand. Rachel retreated into a dark corner of the living room, holding her breath. She knew she couldn't fight 2 gunmen with only a kitchen knife. She knew that if they found her, she'd die. But she wouldn't let them find Hannah. She'd die first. "Find the Morgan girl," one of the men said, his voice low and cold. "Clean it up. Leave no witnesses." Rachel tightened her grip on the knife, her body drawn taut as a wire, braced for the inevitable. Then the elevator doors slid open. Ethan Carrington stepped out with his gun already drawn, and what Rachel witnessed in the next half-minute forever changed how she saw the man. He didn't shout warnings like in the movies. He didn't say a word. He moved with the cold precision of a machine programmed to kill. The first shot hit the nearest attacker in the shoulder, sending him crashing down and dropping his weapon. The second man spun and fired back, the bullet grazing Ethan's arm, but he didn't slow. He shifted sideways, fired again into the man's leg. Then when the attacker fell, Ethan strode forward and delivered a single punch to his face that knocked him unconscious instantly. It all happened in less than 30 seconds. No theatrics, no dramatic dialogue, just efficient and merciless violence. Rachel felt sick. Not from the blood. She'd seen blood many times in her life. But from how easy it all looked. From the way Ethan carried out those acts as if he'd done them hundreds of times before. From the reality that the man she was working with was a professional killer, and she'd known that in theory, but seeing it with her own eyes was something else entirely. Ethan turned to her, his expression still icy and focused. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone level as if he'd just returned from a walk rather than taken down 2 gunmen. Rachel nodded, not trusting her voice. "Hannah. In the bathroom. Go get her." Ethan passed her and went to Michael, who was struggling to sit up with blood soaking his shoulder. He hauled Michael to his feet and said something Rachel couldn't catch, then pulled out his phone and started making calls, his voice low and rapid, ordering a cleanup crew to come in. "We have 10 minutes, Ethan said, glancing briefly at Rachel as he ended the call. "The police scanner is jammed, but it won't hold forever." Rachel forced herself toward the bathroom, her legs shaking but moving anyway. She knocked and called Hannah's name, and when the door opened, her sister collapsed into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Rachel held Hannah, looking over her shoulder at Ethan, standing in the wrecked apartment, stepping over the unconscious attackers as if they were trash on the floor. She thought about what she'd just seen, about the real Ethan Carrington he no longer bothered to hide. He was the Shadow, the crime lord who controlled half of Chicago's underworld, the man whose traitors vanished without a trace. And she owed him her life and Hannah's. Rachel didn't know what that meant for the future, but she knew one thing for certain. Victoria had declared war, and after tonight there would be no turning back for any of them. 1 week after the attack, after Rachel and Hannah had been moved to a new safe apartment in River North, a ghost from the past surfaced. Michael Torres called Rachel that afternoon, his voice tense in a way she hadn't heard before. "There's a man asking about you in Englewood," he said. "His name is Frank Doyle. He claims he's your stepfather." Rachel felt the blood in her body freeze. She hadn't heard that name in 11 years, not since the night she stole $300 from his wallet and ran with Hannah. 11 years of living in fear that he'd find them. And now, just when her life was already shattered enough, Frank Doyle decided to reappear. "What does he want?" Rachel asked, even though she already knew. "Money," Michael replied. "He heard rumors you're connected to the Carrington family and thinks you've got cash." Rachel gave a bitter laugh that hurt her chest. Of course, Frank Doyle never changed. He'd beaten her for 6 years, burned her wrists with cigarettes, kicked her in the stomach until she couldn't stand for hours, and now he thought she'd hand him money. "I want to meet him," Rachel said, her calm so sharp it was frightening. Silence stretched on the line. "Ethan won't agree," Michael said at last. "I don't need Ethan's approval," Rachel replied. "I need a location and backup. I'll handle the rest myself." 3 hours later, Rachel stood inside an abandoned warehouse on the south side, weak light from industrial bulbs spilling onto cracked concrete floors. Ethan waited in the shadows at the far corner, saying nothing, only watching. Rachel had made it clear she didn't want him intervening. She only needed to know he was there in case things went wrong. He didn't like it, she could tell from the tight line of his jaw, but he respected her choice. Frank Doyle staggered into the warehouse with the gait of a chronic drunk. He looked older than Rachel remembered, hair almost entirely gray, face hollow and deeply lined, but his eyes still carried the greed and cruelty she'd never forget. He spotted Rachel and flashed a grin that revealed yellowed teeth. "Rachel," he said, his voice shrill and painfully familiar. "There's my girl. Look at you, dressed fancy, running with rich people, and forgetting who put a roof over your head." "You didn't raise me," Rachel said, her voice steel cold. "You beat me." Frank snorted and waved a hand as if it meant nothing. "Discipline. Kids need discipline. But that's old news. I'm here because I heard you're dealing with the Carrington family. Figured maybe you should share a little of that good fortune with the man who gave you shelter." Rachel looked at the man in front of her, the one who'd turned her childhood into hell, who'd forced her and Hannah to flee across 6 states, who'd carved scars into her body and soul that would never fade, and she didn't feel afraid. She'd feared him for 11 years, but standing here now after everything she'd endured, Frank Doyle looked small and pathetic. "You're leaving Chicago tonight," Rachel said, each word clean and final. "You'll never contact me or Hannah again. You'll forget we exist." Frank laughed loudly, but the sound died when he saw Ethan step out of the shadows. The man in the black suit didn't speak, only stood there with eyes cold as ice, and Frank, slow as he was sharp enough to sense danger. "Who's that?" Frank asked, his voice trembling now. "That's the man who'll make sure you do what I say," Rachel replied. Ethan advanced 1 step, and that single step was enough to make Frank retreat 3. "Mr. Doyle," Ethan said, his voice low and steady like the growl of a predator. "I hear you've got a habit of hitting women and children. Where I grew up, we've got very specific ways of dealing with men like you." "I don't want trouble," Frank blurted, his face gone pale. I'm leaving right now." "Good," Ethan said with a nod. "And Mr. Doyle, if I hear even a whisper about you trying to contact Rachel or Hannah, I'll find you, and our next conversation won't end with you walking away." Frank Doyle vanished through the warehouse doors so fast he was nearly running. Rachel stood watching him go, waiting for triumph or relief to hit, but neither came, only emptiness and bone-deep exhaustion. She didn't need Ethan to save her from Frank Doyle. She'd saved herself from him 11 years ago when she was 17 and had nothing but courage. But having backup, having someone at her back so she knew she wasn't alone, that was something she'd never had before, and she didn't yet know what to do with that feeling. The night before the Carrington Foundation's spring charity ball, Rachel couldn't sleep. She sat on the balcony of the safe apartment in River North, staring at the Chicago skyline, lights flickering like millions of stars trapped inside concrete and glass. Hannah had fallen asleep at 10 o'clock, exhausted after days of tension, and the apartment was so quiet Rachel could hear her own heartbeat. She heard a door open and close softly, familiar footsteps crossing the living room. Ethan appeared at the balcony doorway with 2 glasses of whiskey in his hands and handed one to her without asking whether she wanted it. Rachel took it, feeling the brief warmth of his fingers brushing hers before he pulled away. He sat in the chair beside her, leaving just enough space, and the two of them watched the city in silence. "You'll come with me to the gala tomorrow," Ethan said. Not a question. "I know." Rachel took a sip of whiskey and felt it burn down her throat. That was the plan from the start. Silence stretched for several more minutes. Then Ethan spoke again, his voice lower than usual. "Are you afraid?" Rachel considered the question. Afraid. She'd lived in fear for most of her life. Afraid of Frank Doyle. Afraid she wouldn't have enough money to take care of Hannah. Afraid of being found, hurt, betrayed. But tonight, sitting here with the man she still didn't fully trust, preparing to walk into the den of people who destroyed her family, Rachel didn't feel afraid. She felt ready. "No," she answered honestly. "I've been afraid long enough." Ethan nodded as if that didn't surprise him. He stared into the distance, his dark irises reflecting the city lights like shards of broken glass. "I killed someone for the first time when I was 18, he said, his voice flat, as though he were reading the weather report. "A man who betrayed my father, tried to sell information to our rivals. My father handed me the gun and told me that was how we dealt with traitors." Rachel said nothing, only listened. She understood he wasn't telling her this to impress her or earn pity. He was showing her who he really was, stripped of polish and excuses. "I couldn't sleep for 3 months after that," Ethan went on. "Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Then my father told me weakness was a luxury people like us couldn't afford. He said I had to learn to live with what I'd done, or I wouldn't survive long in that world." "So you learned?" Rachel asked. Ethan turned to her, and for a moment Rachel saw something behind his cold exterior. Not weakness, but the exhaustion of someone who'd carried too much for too long. "I learned how to pretend," he replied. "That's not the same thing, but it's enough to survive." Rachel understood him better than almost anyone ever could. She'd learned how to pretend too. Pretend she was strong when she wanted to collapse. Pretend she was fine when she was drowning. Pretend she wasn't scared when she was so terrified she could barely breathe. That was how she survived Frank Doyle, the years of running, 7 years working inside the mansion of people who'd killed her father without knowing it. "I've got a scar on my back," Rachel said, the first time she'd volunteered that truth to anyone besides Hannah. "Frank used a belt. The night I was 16, I dropped a plate of food and he beat me so badly I couldn't lie on my back for 2 weeks. Ethan didn't offer empty phrases like "I'm sorry" or "that's horrible." He only looked at her with gray eyes that held no judgment and no pity. Only the recognition of someone who'd seen darkness and knew exactly what it looked like. "And you stayed?" he asked. "Another year," Rachel nodded. "I stayed for Hannah. She was 11. I didn't know how to take care of her alone. Then one night Frank beat me so badly I thought I was going to die. And I realized if I died, Hannah would have nobody. So I stole his money and ran." Silence settled between them. The whiskey in Rachel's glass was gone, but she hadn't noticed. She was staring into the eyes of Ethan Carrington, killer, Mafia boss, the most dangerous man she'd ever met, and seeing the strangest thing, she saw herself. 2 damaged people recognizing each other in a city of 10 million. 2 broken pieces whose sharp edges fit together in a way that wasn't perfect but was real. Rachel didn't know what that meant, and she wasn't sure she wanted to. "Tomorrow we walk into the gala," she said, breaking the moment before it grew too heavy. "Tomorrow we expose Victoria and confront Harrison." And after that, Ethan looked at her, and there was something in his eyes she couldn't decipher. "Then we'll figure it out," he said. It wasn't an answer, and they both knew it. But tonight, sitting on the balcony with the city spread beneath their feet, it was all they could give each other. The Carrington mansion blazed with light on the night of the spring charity ball. More than 300 guests in expensive tuxedos and evening gowns gathered beneath crystal chandeliers, soft jazz blending with polite laughter and the sound of champagne being poured into glasses. Rachel stood before a mirror in a nearby hotel room, staring at the woman she almost didn't recognize. The floor-length black gown fit her body perfectly, her hair swept up to reveal the graceful curve of her neck and collarbones, her makeup subtle yet sharp enough to accentuate her gray-blue eyes. She wore no jewelry except her mother's silver bracelet, the only thing she still had from Margaret Morgan. Ethan appeared beside her in the mirror, the 3-piece black suit emphasizing his height and broad shoulders. He said nothing, only held out his hand, and Rachel placed hers in it. They left the hotel and climbed into the car, and during the short ride to the Carrington estate, neither of them spoke. When the vehicle stopped at the front gate, Rachel drew in a slow, steady breath. She'd passed through those gates thousands of times over 7 years, always through the back entrance, always in a maid's black uniform, always invisible. Tonight she would walk through the front door, and she wouldn't be invisible anymore. The massive doors opened, and Rachel entered beside Ethan Carrington. The effect was almost immediate. Conversations around them softened, then stopped altogether, as if someone had pressed mute on an enormous remote control. Hundreds of eyes turned toward them, and Rachel felt the weight of every stare like stones settling on her shoulders. She recognized some faces, guests she'd once served champagne and canapes to, people who'd looked straight through her as though she didn't exist. Now they were staring with shock, curiosity, and in some cases undisguised disdain. Rachel kept her expression calm and walked at Ethan's side as if she belonged there. She saw Harrison Carrington near the bar, a glass of scotch frozen halfway to his lips when he recognized her. Catherine Carrington sat on a sofa by the fireplace, her face draining of color as though she'd seen a ghost. And Victoria. Victoria stood in the center of the hall in a blazing red gown, blue eyes widening in shock before narrowing into slits of pure hatred. Rachel's gaze locked with Victoria's across the room, and in that moment everything else vanished. There were only 2 women, 2 half-sisters with only one aware of the truth, staring at each other with everything that couldn't be spoken aloud. Victoria murmured something to the woman beside her, then peeled away from the crowd and headed for the staircase leading upstairs. Rachel understood the message. "I need a minute," she murmured to Ethan. He followed the direction of Victoria's departure, then nodded. "I'll stay close." Rachel climbed the stairs, moving through corridors she'd walked 1,000 times as the housekeeper. Victoria waited inside a guest powder room, the door clicking shut behind Rachel. The 2 women faced each other in the small space, light from the bulbs around the mirror washing over their features. "You've got nerve showing up here," Victoria said first, her voice trembling with restrained fury. "After everything you've done." "Everything I've done," Rachel scoffed, the sound icy. "I'm not the one who stole documents and framed an innocent woman. I'm not the one who sent gunmen to kill a woman and her sister. I'm not the one who sabotaged a student's scholarship just to punish her sibling." Victoria's eye twitched, and Rachel knew she hadn't expected Rachel to know that much. "You don't know anything," Victoria snapped, though her voice wavered now. "You're just a maid who thought she could play in a world that never belonged to her." "I know enough." Rachel stepped forward and Victoria retreated a pace. "I know about the hard drive. I know about the Cayman Islands account. I know about your Thursday afternoon calls. And I know why you hate me so much, Victoria. Stop talking." Victoria lifted a hand as though she could physically halt the words pouring from Rachel's mouth. "I know James Whitmore was my father," Rachel said, each syllable driven like a nail into a coffin. "I know you and I are half-sisters. And I know you're terrified that if the truth comes out, you'll lose everything you've got." Victoria's face turned paper white, her red-painted lips trembling. "You can't prove anything," she whispered, sounding as though she were trying to convince herself more than Rachel. "Nobody will believe you." "I don't need anyone to believe me," Rachel replied, her voice calm enough to be chilling. "I've got proof. And after tonight, the whole world will know who you really are." Rachel turned and walked out, leaving Victoria alone with the fear she'd hidden for 3 decades. When she returned to the ballroom, she saw Ethan standing near the staircase, his sharp gaze tracking her the instant she appeared. He didn't ask how the conversation had gone. He didn't need to. He simply offered his hand, and Rachel placed hers in it. The game had begun. At 10 o'clock that night, Harrison Carrington stepped onto the small stage at the far end of the ballroom to speak about the Carrington Foundation's achievements over the past year, his voice booming through the sound system with the confidence of a man who'd never been forced to face the consequences of his actions. Rachel stood beside Ethan in a shadowed corner of the room, watching the man who'd threatened her mother, might have killed her father, and had treated her like trash for 7 years. She waited, counting every second in her head. At exactly 10:15, the front doors of the mansion swung open. Special Agent Patricia Hayes entered first, followed by a team of 8 FBI agents in black suits and body armor, federal badges flashing beneath the chandeliers. The music cut off. Conversation vanished. 300 guests froze like expensive wax figures, staring at the agents advancing into the hall with undisguised shock. Harrison Carrington faltered mid-speech, the champagne glass in his hand trembling as he realized what was happening. Harrison Carrington. Agent Hayes's voice rang out clear and commanding in the deadly silence of the room. "You are under arrest for money laundering, tax evasion, securities fraud, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "No," Harrison said, his voice stripped of confidence now and thick with confusion and fury. "This is a mistake. You can't do this. I've got a warrant signed by a federal judge," Agent Hayes replied coolly, stepping onto the stage with handcuffs in her grip. "And I've got enough evidence to make sure you won't see daylight for at least 20 years. 2 other agents climbed onto the stage, seized Harrison's arms, and cuffed him in front of the 300 most powerful people in Chicago. Catherine Carrington collapsed into a chair, her face drained of color, eyes wide with shock. Some guests began whispering, phones slipping from pockets, and Rachel knew within minutes the news would race across the city. Then Victoria burst from the crowd, her face twisted with panic and desperation. "This is Ethan," she screamed, pointing toward him beside Rachel. "He set all of this up. He betrayed his family. He, Victoria Whitmore Carrington," Agent Hayes cut in, motioning for 2 more agents to move toward Victoria. "You're also under arrest for theft, conspiracy, attempted murder, and fraud." "No," Victoria staggered backward, her eyes wild as they swept the room in search of escape. "You don't understand," she pointed at Rachel. "She's the problem. She's James Whitmore's bastard. She's my half-sister. She came here to steal everything that belongs to me." The hall erupted in murmurs. Hundreds of eyes swung toward Rachel, and she felt each stare like needles pressing into her skin. But she didn't bow her head, didn't step back, didn't let a single emotion show on her face. She stood tall with all the dignity her mother had taught her, and let her silence speak for her. Victoria kept shouting, her voice shrill and completely unhinged. "Can't you see? She's a threat. She'll take everything. I was only protecting what's mine." I was only 2 FBI agents grabbed Victoria's arms and snapped cuffs onto her wrists, cutting off the manic tirade. She kept screaming as they dragged her from the room, but no one was listening anymore. Everyone was looking at Rachel. Rachel stepped out of the shadows and walked into the center of the hall with steady strides and her head held high. She didn't defend herself, didn't explain, didn't beg for sympathy. She simply stood there among people who'd once treated her like decoration and let them see who she really was. "My name is Rachel Morgan," she finally said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "My mother was Margaret Morgan. My father was James Whitmore. I didn't come here to claim an inheritance or a name. I came because Victoria Carrington destroyed my life to hide a secret she was terrified of. And I came to say that the truth, no matter how long it's buried, always comes to light." She turned to Harrison Carrington, now standing between 2 FBI agents with cuffs on his wrists, his face aged 20 years in a matter of minutes. "And you," she added, her tone holding no hatred, only the exhaustion of someone who'd carried too much for too long. "You threatened my mother, tore my family apart, and may have killed my father. I don't need an apology. I only need you to face justice." Agent Hayes signaled her team, and Harrison Carrington was escorted out of his own mansion, through doors he'd passed through thousands of times like a king, now as a criminal. Rachel remained in the middle of the ballroom watching his figure disappear, and she didn't feel victorious. She felt empty, as though she'd carried a massive stone on her shoulders for 28 years, and it had finally been set down, leaving behind a hollow space she didn't yet know how to fill. Before Harrison Carrington was led to the FBI vehicle, he stopped at the front doors and turned back to look at Rachel. His eyes, once cold and commanding, now appeared tired and hollow, like those of a man who'd fought too long and finally accepted defeat. Agent Hayes motioned for the agents to pause, and Rachel stepped forward until she stood less than 2 meters from him. They faced each other in silence, and around them the remaining guests in the ballroom held their breath, waiting. "James loved your mother," Harrison finally said, his voice hoarse and quieter than Rachel had ever heard it. "He loved Margaret in a way he'd never loved anyone else, and I couldn't accept that. I couldn't accept that my closest friend was willing to abandon everything we'd built for a woman I believed wasn't worthy." Rachel stayed silent, waiting. She didn't press him or interrupt, only stood there and let Harrison speak what he needed to speak. "I threatened Margaret to make her leave," Harrison went on, his gaze drifting past Rachel, as though staring into the past. "I told her that if she didn't disappear, I'd make sure she and the child she carried would never have a peaceful life. Margaret was so frightened she ran without telling James she was pregnant. I thought that was the end of it. I thought James would forget her and everything would return to normal. He paused, swallowing hard as though the next words weighed too much to say aloud. But James didn't forget. 2 years later, he somehow learned the truth. He discovered where Margaret was and decided to go to her and the child. He told me he was going to leave everything. The business, his family, the empire we built. To live with the woman he loved and the daughter he'd never met. "You killed my father," Rachel said, not a question. Harrison looked at her for the first time since he'd begun speaking, and there was something in his eyes Rachel hadn't expected. Not true remorse, but not complete coldness either. Something in between, complicated and undefinable. "I didn't do it with my own hands," he said, "but I knew James's brakes were cut. I knew before he got into that car that morning, and I did nothing to stop it. I let him die because I thought it was the only way to protect everything we'd built." A heavy silence settled between them. Rachel could feel hundreds of eyes on her, waiting for a reaction. They wanted her to cry, to scream, to give them something dramatic to trade in whispers the next day. But Rachel didn't give them that. "I don't need your apology," she said, her voice calm and clear. "An apology doesn't give my mother back after years of poverty and fear. It doesn't bring my father back. It doesn't erase 28 years of growing up without knowing who I was." Harrison nodded slowly, accepting those words without protest. He didn't ask for forgiveness, and Rachel respected that even though she hated him. At least he was honest enough not to pretend regret when he didn't truly feel it. "But I also don't need you to suffer anything more at my hands," Rachel continued. "Justice will be carried out by the legal system. I've got no intention of spending the rest of my life hating a man who's already lost everything. I've got better things to do with my time." She turned and walked away without looking back. Behind her, Agent Hayes signaled the agents to proceed, and Harrison Carrington was led out of his own mansion for the final time. Rachel didn't watch him go. She walked straight to where Ethan waited at the far end of the hall, and when she reached him he said nothing, only placed a hand at the small of her back and guided her outside. They passed through the front doors of the Carrington estate into the cold Chicago night, and Rachel drew a deep breath. The winter air cut into her lungs like knives, but it was clean and free in a way she'd never felt before. She didn't forgive Harrison Carrington. She didn't think she ever would. But she wouldn't let hatred define the rest of her life. She would move forward, because that was what her mother had done, and it was the only thing that mattered now. 6 months after the night of the fateful gala, the Carrington Empire no longer existed as it once had. Harrison Carrington was awaiting trial at the Metropolitan Correctional Center Federal Prison in Chicago, his attorneys predicting a sentence of 15 to 20 years if he was lucky, and far longer if he wasn't. Victoria Whitmore Carrington accepted a plea deal with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, 10 years with the possibility of early release after 7 if she behaved. And she lost everything, her money, her reputation, and the position in the family she'd tried to protect at all costs. Catherine Carrington divorced Harrison the moment the charges were finalized and vanished from Chicago, rumored to have gone to Florida to live with distant relatives, and nobody cared enough to confirm it. The family's illegal operations were shut down completely after the FBI investigation, and Ethan kept the legitimate businesses, beginning to rebuild them from the ground up in his own way, pulling himself out of the criminal underworld, in a process that wasn't easy and was often dangerous, but one he was taking step by step. Thomas Reed cooperated fully with the FBI and was spared prosecution, in exchange for surrendering his law license and leaving Chicago permanently. The scholarship fraud allegations against Hannah Morgan were dismissed after the FBI investigation uncovered Victoria as the architect behind the scheme. Hannah returned to school, completed her final exams with the highest scores in her class, and on a warm afternoon in May, Rachel sat in the front row at the University of Illinois Chicago commencement ceremony, watching her sister walk across the stage to receive her bachelor's degree in nursing. Rachel didn't cry when Hannah's name was called. She simply smiled, the first genuine smile she'd had in months, and thought of her mother and the promise she'd made 17 years earlier at her hospital bedside. Take care of Hannah. Give her the chance I never had, and she had kept it. Ethan sat beside Rachel during the ceremony, saying little, simply being there the way he'd been for the past 6 months, and whatever existed between them still hadn't been clearly defined. Not love in the conventional sense, but not merely alliance or business either. They were 2 people who'd walked through hell together, and were still learning how to heal, one day at a time. A week after Hannah's graduation, Rachel drove to the outskirts of Detroit to the small cemetery where Margaret Morgan had been buried 17 years earlier. She went alone, declining both Hannah's and Ethan's offers to come with her, because this was something she needed to do by herself. Margaret's grave looked the same as Rachel remembered it, a simple gray granite headstone etched with the words Margaret Morgan, beloved mother. She hadn't had the money to add anything else when her mother died, and now she thought she would keep it that way. Her mother didn't need flowery words carved into stone to be remembered. Rachel set a bouquet of white lilies beside the marker and sat down in the grass without caring that her dress would get dirty. I found out the truth, Mom, she said, her voice quiet but steady. About my father, about Harrison, about everything. I understand why you kept it secret. You were protecting me in the only way you knew how, and I don't blame you for that. The wind moved softly through the cemetery, stirring the branches around her, and Rachel traced a finger along the carved letters. Hannah graduated, she went on. Top of her class. She's going to be a great nurse. You'd be so proud if you could see her now. She paused, thinking about what she wanted to say next. No drama, no tears, just simple truth between a daughter and the mother she'd lost. I didn't take their money, Rachel said. My father's will left part of his estate to me, but I don't want it. I'm going to use it to start a foundation for women who've suffered domestic abuse. Women like you, women who need a safe place to run and a chance to begin again. I think you'd like that. She stood and brushed the grass from her dress. I'm going to be all right, Mom, she said quietly. For the first time in my life, I really believe that. Rachel turned and walked away without looking back. She didn't need to look back. Her mother would always be there, in her memory, in the silver bracelet she wore every day, in the way she loved Hannah, and in the resilience she'd learned from the woman who raised her alone in poverty, yet never let love run short. Rachel returned to Chicago in the late afternoon, the sunset painting the city skyline red as she drove across the bridge into River North. Ethan was waiting for her in the apartment, standing by the window overlooking the city the same way she had stood the night before the gala months earlier. He turned when he heard the door open, and the two of them looked at each other across the room in silence. You went alone, he asked. I needed to, Rachel replied as she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Ethan nodded as if he understood, and maybe he truly did. He poured her a glass of water and handed it to her. Then they both sat on the living room sofa, leaving the same careful distance they always kept. Hannah texted me, Ethan said. She got the job at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Rachel smiled for the first time that day. I know. She called me on the drive back. She's going to be a great nurse. Silence settled between them, but not the uncomfortable kind. It was the quiet of two people who'd grown used to each other's presence, who didn't need to fill every moment with meaningless words. Finally, Ethan spoke. What are you going to do now? Rachel considered the question. 6 months earlier, she'd had nothing but anger and a hunger for revenge. Now both had been satisfied, and she stood in front of an empty future, waiting to be shaped. The foundation will take time to set up, she said. I need to find leadership, build infrastructure, establish support programs. It'll be a full-time commitment for at least 1 or 2 years. And after that, Rachel looked at him, assessing. Are you asking about work or about us? Ethan didn't avoid her gaze. Both. Rachel set the glass on the table and turned fully toward him. I don't know what the future looks like, she said plainly. I don't know whether we can function like a normal couple, because neither of us is normal. You're a former Mafia boss trying to live legally, and I'm the daughter of a man your father may have had killed. That's not an ideal foundation for a relationship. Ethan didn't argue. He only watched her and waited. But I also don't want to pretend the last 6 months didn't mean anything, Rachel went on. You were there for me when nobody else was. You believed me when everyone thought I was a thief. You gave me a chance to reclaim justice and protect Hannah. I can't ignore that. So what are you proposing? Rachel drew in a slow breath. We try, she said. No promises about forever. No pretending we know how things will end. Just two damaged people seeing whether they can build something together. If it doesn't work, we're mature enough to admit it and move on. And if it does, Ethan asked. And for the first time, Rachel saw something like hope flicker behind his hardened exterior. If it does, we'll figure out the next step when we get there, Rachel replied. I don't plan my life too far ahead anymore. I've learned that everything can change overnight. Ethan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right, he said simply. We try. There was no blazing kiss, no declaration of eternal love, no promise of happily ever after. Just two people who'd walked through darkness and were still searching for the light, deciding they would try walking together instead of alone. Rachel thought about the road that had brought her here. From a 17-year-old girl running into the night with her 7-year-old sister in her arms to the woman sitting here now, who'd faced the people who destroyed her family and didn't bow. She'd lost so much. Her mother, the father she'd never known, 7 years of her life to a family that didn't deserve them. But she'd also found things she never expected. The truth about who she was, justice for the wronged, and maybe a chance to love and be loved in return. Life isn't perfect. It never is. But it's still worth living, worth fighting for, and worth hoping for. That was the lesson Margaret Morgan taught her daughter with her own life. And it was the lesson Rachel would carry for the rest of her days. Rachel Morgan's story reminds us that the truth, no matter how long it's buried, will eventually surface. That justice, even when delayed, still arrives. And that even in the darkest circumstances, people can find light if they're strong enough to keep moving forward. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, like, and share this video so we can keep bringing you meaningful stories every day. How did Rachel's story make you feel? In your own life, have you ever faced something similar, when the truth was hidden and justice delayed? Share your thoughts and feelings from deep in your heart in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories. We wish everyone watching good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Thank you for staying with us. Goodbye and see you in the next video.